Welcome to this HTML video where we'll be discussing tables. Now, tables in HTML used to be used to lay out pages and stuff, but we shouldn't do that. The only reason we should use tables is if we have a table of data. To create a table, we use the table tag and we have a closing tag. Now, this table acts like a div on the outside or a main tag or a header. So if we want to center the table on our page, we would do margin auto for that, which I'll show later. But on the inside, we're able to create table rows with the TR tag, and then each cell is created with a TD tag, which stands for table data. Now we can't really see these cells because there's no border between them. We can add a border with the border attribute, and that'll allow us to see the cells, but we shouldn't keep this because this was the old way of doing things before CSS, and this will actually create a validation error. But while I design my table, I'm going to use this so that we can see our cells. Now I added 2 additional rows by copying and pasting and adding some more cells, and as you can see, we have more rows. Now it's important to make sure that the number of cells that we have stays consistent across each row. So we can see that we have 3 columns in the top row, but now that in this row we have 4 columns, and you can see that that kind of makes our table look a little odd. Now I've gone ahead and added some actual data into this table, and I'm going to create a table that has my class schedule in it. And you can see up here, I created a row to label my columns. So this is the department, the course number, the time, and the location. Now we want to make sure our table is accessible. And what that means is we're using a screen reader. We should be able to know that 240 is the course number. But right now, there's no way to connect that up because we're still calling all of these cells. But we can use the TH tag instead, which says that this is a table header. And now the screen reader will be able to connect up that 240 is the number because 240 is in the same column with the table header tag that has number inside of it. Now, another thing we can do with our table is have a cell span multiple rows. So right here, notice the location is the same. Of course, the department and the number is the same as well, but I'll demonstrate this on the location. So instead of having P3 in both rows, we can have this span to another row, and we'll do that with the row span. Now we can see that this location or this cell that has the P3 in it has now expanded and gone down a row. But it had the unintended consequence of adding a column into this row because this one spans down into here, and now we have this extra location. So we have to make sure that we take one cell off of the row below so that our table still looks nice. Now we can also have cells span multiple columns. For instance, if I create a new row here right underneath the headers, and I call this my information technology courses, if I want this cell to span across all 4 columns, then I can add a column span attribute onto the table data, and that'll allow my cell to span across all the columns. Now I've added some more rows, and one more thing I want to do is add another column for the number of credits the class is. And as you can see, you have to be a little careful when you add another column. You also have to update your row spans and possibly your column spans. So updating those to 5, and now they span all the way across. And one tag that we can add, and this is optional, is we can add a T-head tag, and that's short for table header, and we can take our cells that are meant to label columns or and be the top of our table and put them inside of our table head section. And we can also add a table body section for all the cells that contain the data inside of our table. And so as you can see, the table body contains all of these cells, and the table header contains the headers up here. Now, again, this is optional, but it could help us with our CSS so that we don't have to put classes on specific rows. We can use these tags so that we can style up our headers different than the body. Now, there is one more tag, which is the table footer. And you might wonder, well, what do we put in the table footer? And maybe this is some summary results where we add up all the credits or average out the number of credits that we're teaching or some other thing like that. So now we can add up our total credits, and we can even do a row span to move this 12 over to this credits column. And not a row span, but a column span. And so this is the kind of information that we might put in our footer. Now we have introduced another problem for accessibility because it's hard to tie this 12 to the heading total credits because it's not in the same column. So to make this accessible, what we do is we add an ID onto the heading, and I'll call this total credits. And then in the cell that should be labeled by, we use the headers and we put the same name as the ID of the total credit so it can link up the label with the data. Now that we have a good table on our page, let's go ahead and style this up and make the table look better. Now the first thing we want to do is remove this right here because that is no longer valid HTML. It is nice to kind of see the borders as we develop our table, but now that we have our table, let's use CSS to develop it. And the first thing we might want to do is center our table on the page. And the way we do that is the same way we do it with a div tag. So let's go ahead and add a class onto the table. And you can see by using the margin auto, at least on the sides of the table, remember this is the top and bottom and this controls the side, that we get our table centered on the page. Now what about adding borders? Well, we can add a border to the table in our CSS, and that only adds a border on the outside. We also have to add a border onto all of our cells. So if we select our TDs, then we get the border around our table data cells, but if you notice our heading cells are missing, so we can add that on by adding a comma here and then having a selector to select our TH cells. And now we have borders just like before. Now what if we want a little bit more space in our cells? Well, we can just add some padding. And that gives us a little bit more space. Now what if we want a little bit more space between our cells? And the way we do that is we add on the table itself. So notice this is selecting the table tag. We add a border spacing property, and we can add any amount we want. And that increases our spacing, and we could also shut off all the spacing by putting 0. And now all of our cells have come back together. Now, if you notice, these lines are a little bit thicker than before, and that's because we have two cells right next to each other, and we have the border on this cell and the border on this cell, and they're not overlapping, so we get a double thick line. So if we don't want that, we can do our border collapse property and tell it to be collapsed. And now we get a thinner line on our borders. So I took the borders out so we can play with the background colors. And we can add a background color for the full table, as you can see here, or we can add a background color to just certain rows or columns. And as you can see, by using the T head here, we can select just our headers and add a unique background just for the headers. We can also do the same thing for the body and the footer as well. Now, one nice thing to do with our tables is to highlight or have a different background color for every other row. And we can accomplish that by selecting the table rows that are inside of our table body. And instead of having every one be a background color, we can use a pseudo class and child. And with that, we can put a number inside. And we can see the second row inside of our table body now has the background color. And because it does the column span, we get this background color down here as well. A better option would be to say every odd cell. And now we can see that every other row has a different background color. We can also choose the even cells. And you see that we get every other row on the evens. Now there's more that we can do here, but this should give you enough information to make your table look the way you want to.